King Maris of Resopolis walked through the human encampment, his golden armour drawing glances even out of those humans. They were strange people, so desperately trying to suppress their nature, but then again Miala told him that they were the best warriors of the Steel Eagle, or as they called it, the United Earth Federation. He himself, an acolyte of the Temple of Res, understood it all too well. The better warrior gets less emotions, he shows, but those humans seem to really try hard to be like automatons. They certainly seem to run things like well-oiled mechanisms, that's for sure. If he was not the king, he would definitely be unable to walk so freely across their encampment, and even then he had to be assigned escort. They said it was required so that he would not get run over by one of their machines and cause a diplomatic incident. Their structures looked like metal tents and all were so similar, as if they were made by the same mould. What was even more surprising, they managed to build a small city in but a day out of those metal tents. A soldier that was assigned to escort him pointed at this strange metal tent that was about 3 times bigger than any other. Some other human soldiers carried a huge box into this tent, and that's when he saw him, General Jake Abramson. First time he met him, he was wearing more elaborate clothing than what he was wearing now. As a matter of fact, this human general was wearing the same strangely patterned cloth as other soldiers. The human general did not notice him as he followed in a human soldiers, carrying a strange box into their tent. "What is this, General?" Maris said in broken English as he entered the tent and saw a human general staring intensely at the open box. He seemed rather hateful with its contents. This is a nuclear device, King Maris, Jake said, not to take his eyes away from the nuclear weapon, with the name Ragnarok written on it, and 50 MGT rattling engraved right beneath the symbol of radioactivity, right next to the turned-off screen. "So you brought the most powerful of your weapons," Maris said, as he approached to finally get a glimpse of this weapon. Aside from writings on it which he could not understand, it looked like a box of some sort itself with a bunch of differently coloured wires running all across it. Maris was actually rather disappointed. He expected at least some lights running all around. Instead, it was just this boring box with a screen on it. "I have no intention of ever using it," Jake said, as if he was refusing the deal with the devil, and closed the box and finally took his eyes away from the box and looked at Maris. "Why not?" Maris said, with sudden realization that there was indeed more to this box than he had expected. "Have you ever watched an entire city be wiped out? Have millions of lives snuffed out in a matter of seconds, but with a single move of a hand?" Jake said, returning his gaze back to the coffin of death, as he put his hands around his waist. "I can't say I have," Maris said slowly, after considering the words he just heard. "Well, I did," Jake said, as he pointed in the direction of the door on the other side of the room within this tent, and began walking towards it. Maris quickly picked up on the fact that this human general was not going to discuss this matter here among the rest of his people, and was indeed inviting him to his personal room. As they approached that room, made out of some manner of glass, Maris could see the metal table with screen on 2 chairs in front of that table and one behind it. There also was a weapons rack and a couple of other metal cases inside. Jake was the first to enter and pointed to the chair, while he himself sat down behind the screen. With a couple of touches of the screen, the transparent walls of the room quickly turned murky. "So you've seen this weapon in action," Maris said, the moment no one could see into the transparent room, as his armor with metallic zinc collapsed on the metal chair. "Yes, I did," Jake said, as he opened one of the cabinets under the table and pulled out a bottle of whiskey with 2 shots of glass. "So, is that bad?" Maris said, as he was staring at the brown, transparent spirit filling in the glass container in front of him. "We developed this weapon about 1,000 years ago, and used it in anger of war for the first time, only to finally realize if this is what total war will look like, we can no longer wage it, for it would end us." With these words, Jake raised his glass of whiskey, as if indicating that now they were drinking. Maris did the same, and they both took a sip of oak-infused alcohol at the same time. "What happened?" Maris said, as he leaned back ready to hear a story. 1945. One of the nation-states of Old Earth dropped 2 atomic bombs on the other nation-state. Just sparklers compared to what I have here. Jake pointed in the direction of the door. Sure, other methods of destruction warring nations used during that war brought about far greater devastation and loss of life, but they had to be used en masse and over a long period of time, and this weapon was so devastating, so powerful, that we recoiled from using it in anger ever again. Jake stopped there for a second. and then decided to take a bigger gulp of the spirit. Those who stood right at the epicenter of the explosion were atomized on the spot, and those that were a couple hundred meters away only left burnt marks on the walls, and those were the lucky ones, because those who survived the initial blast now were facing slow and painful death from radiation sickness. In the following 4 months, it was estimated that up to 220,000 people have died from both bombings. That's when Maris, as if by instinct, looked back at the closed door and took a bigger gulp himself. The warring nation, despite its fanatical zeal, surrendered shortly after that, for it was no longer a weapon of war, it was a tool of absolute destruction, and no amount of zeal could stand to the power of gods that was now in the hands of the opposing force, Jake said, as he stared at the bottom of the shot of glass with whiskey in it. That would make sense. I guess this nation conquered your planet shortly after. Maris leaned forward, trying, as he finished his glass of spirit, already feeling somewhat tipsy. To what Jake just chuckled and downed his shot. Then he grabbed the bottle with a gesture, offered to refill the glass of his guest. Maris nodded. No, it didn't. You see, we humans are a crafty bunch. Within 4 years, other nations had the same weapon, and quite an interesting time followed. A time that is called a Cold War, Jake said, as he first refilled the glass of a guest, and then his. A time of perpetual fear. A time when you had to trust that the other side was not man enough to end the world, despite all the ideological differences, not to mention the ambitions to rule the world, all the while trying to one-up the other. It really looked like 2 boys fighting for the heart of women without actually beating the living shit out of one another, Jake said with a laugh, and Maris joined in a laugh, only to wash it down with another sip. Some say those weapons saved more lives than they have taken, finally proving Gatling right. Make a weapon terrifying enough, and people would no longer dare to go to war. Too bad for Gatling it was not a machine gun, Jake said, shaking his head with a smile, looking down at the table, his glass raised in hand. But that was more than 1,000 years ago. You couldn't have possibly been alive during those times. Maris focused his eyes on the human general. Could it be that they lied about their short lifespans? Because surely this human general was not lying about his experience with this terrifying weapon. You do know we humans had a big war about 20 years ago, Jake said, as he looked to the side as if remembering something traumatic. The Dargorian War, the one in which your kingdom and other human kingdoms fought against the kingdom of Dargoria. They were like cousins to you, for they changed themselves to become stronger, and because of that waged war against the rest of human kingdoms. Maris still was not quite sure about all the details of the conflict, how he could not completely understand how human nations differed from one another. Dargorian Ascendancy, a breakaway colony of Earth. It was one of the few worlds that did not face technological and cultural degradation of the Great Divide. Instead, they focused on mass genetic enhancement of their population, and built their entire society on the idea of a perfect human. Jake was speaking as if he was reciting a paragraph from a historic textbook. Maris looked utterly lost in what he just heard. There were a bunch of words he still did not understand. Jake noticed that, then looked towards the glass of whiskey in his hand, and shrugged before taking a sip, as if maybe that would help him explain things to Maris. I mean, today's humans from technologically advanced worlds are quite different from the humans that first left Earth, Jake said, as he pointed his finger up to the skies as if Earth was somewhere up there. Like, take a look at us citizens of the United Earth Federation. We have government-mandated gene therapies and enhancements as part of the federal medical care. We have more robust organs, antiseptic blood, and immunity to most viruses on a genetic level. Jake once again noticed that Maris was quite lost with all those stranger terms. Basically, we live longer and are not quite as affected by the diseases. Jake finally gave up on trying to sound smart, as he spread out his arms with a glass of whiskey in his right arm. That's when Maris nodded in understanding, and finally dared to take a sip. Callistians have even further modifications, which also include cosmetics and practice rejuvenation. Corporations, well, it's all about the money in corporate confederacy. You can pay for it, you can have it, and plenty do it. It's one of the major businesses there. And then you have the Dargorians. Jake pointed his index finger of his hand, which held the glass of whiskey at Maris, and then took a sip. So, how different are they from you? Maris leaned forward, ready to take up more information. Even before the war, we knew that they could live up to 300 years without even practicing rejuvenation like Callistians did. Their immune system was not just enhanced, but was completely different from the rest of us. They never had cancer. They were twice stronger than ordinary humans, and could recover from even the harshest wounds. Hell, they could regrow their limbs back, and they were clever, but lacked empathy whatsoever. They considered that it is better to have input and conditioning than to have empathy. Jake leaned backwards as he put down the glass, staring at the table. But they were not automatons, right? Maris asked, not exactly sure what to make of Dalgorians. Oh, definitely no. Jake raised his eyes back to Maris. They could still have emotions, have ambitions and desires. They just couldn't empathize with others. They had pride and really looked down on anyone who was not Dalgorian. But if they looked down on us, the technologically advanced nations, they were disgusted by the new Terran Empire and Church of Light. A degenerative blight on the human genome that must be cleansed. With those words, they began their crusade. Jake reached for the glass of whiskey to take another sip. A single fucking planet brought to the knees two of the biggest empires across the human territories. Jake took another sip, as he was shaking his head in disbelief of what he just said. Was this a war of conquest? Maris said. Not exactly sure what Jake meant by the word cleansed. It was a war of extermination. Jake leaned forward and looked directly into the eyes of Maris. What? Maris said in utter horror. And it wasn't done through biological weapons or any other weapons of mass destruction. After all, they wanted those planets for themselves. After all, and bioweapons can have unforeseen consequences for everyone involved, Jake said, as his gaze returned back to the table, still trying to make sense of all the madness that happened. They would destroy the military force sent to oppose them, take the cities, round up the civilians, and begin systematically executing them. Jake slowly reached for the shot of whiskey. I guess it is in our genome to kill anything that just looks somewhat different from us. I mean, in prehistoric times, we did wipe out just about any other hominids that proved to be less advanced than us, while not being so cruel to animals. Jake took a good gulp of whiskey, still looking down on the table, his thoughts trying to make sense of the horrors he had witnessed. That's disturbing news, General. Maris reached for his ear with fear in his eyes. After all, Eldems did look a lot like humans, but were somewhat different. Relax. We put a lot of effort in suppressing that aspect about ourselves. Well, at least the Federation and Callistians did. Jake extended his hands in a stop sign with a laugh. Good to hear. What happened next? Maris said, still somewhat suspicious of the human in front of him. We couldn't just sit by and let the genocide happen, so we declared war on the Dalgorian Ascendancy, and I participated in that war. Special Ops Grunt thinking, yeah, I'm so badass, I'm gonna show those genetic uber freaks what a real man looks like. Jake hit himself in the chest. Boy, was I wrong. Then his gaze once again returned to the table. We suffered heaviest losses. For every Dalgorian clone soldier we killed, we had to give 10. But we had a better industry, more ships, more tanks, more strike crafts, more gunships, more rounds, and outnumbered them 20 to 1. Still, it was a fucking meat grinder for both sides, Jake said, as he put his hand over his face. There was a moment during the war when I caught myself on the thought, why the fuck are we not using nukes on those evil bastards? What was also quite surprising was neither did the Dalgorians. I mean, surely this was war on such a level that warrants such destruction. And boy, was I wrong again, Jake said, as he once again looked in the direction of the door. Who used them first? Maris looked back at the door as well. They did. Jake finished his glass of whiskey and poured himself more. Maris still had his glass half full. We finally reached their planet. That was it. We were going to put an end to this madness. Jake spoke through his teeth, not even noticing Maris was still there. I was tasked with taking out the Apex, the head of state of the Dalgorian Ascendancy. The Apex was cooked up in the bunker, surrounded by his top super soldiers, genetic freaks who exchanged their longevity for further genetic modifications to make them even better soldiers. Me and my unit, the Special Orbital Service. Unlike Deltas, my unit specialized and still does in careful planning rather than rapid response, but I digress. We were tasked with taking the Apex into federal custody to face justice for his crimes. Jake took a sip of whiskey, and then put it on the table with anger, somewhat spilling the contents of the glass. We fought tooth and nail to bag the bastard, but when we reached his office, we were hearing gunshots. We busted open the doors just about as this genetic freak was about to kill an Apex daughter, holding on to a 5-year-old boy, while the boss himself was already dead behind a computer screen. So sure, we filled the freak full of lead, but at the end of this firefight, I was the last one standing. Then I went to check if it was like his manifesto on his computer, Jake said, looking at Maris. And I'm seeing a fucking countdown. All the while half the entire federal military was making planetfall. Worst part, comms were scrambled. The daughter begins screaming that her father went completely mad in the past few weeks. Unable to face his defeat, he ordered nukes all over the planet. That Dargoria will never be subservient to lesser creatures. Then, when he heard that our SOS team went after him, he ordered his family be brought to him. They had the final meal. Then he went to his computer and initiated the nuclear cleansing. She says we need to run, but I know that we can't make it to our dropship in time, when I realized he had the fucking 50 megaton nuke under his table, Jake said, as he pointed his hand downwards. I managed to disable it just in time, but then I felt the earth shake. In a panic, I go for his computer, hoping that there is some remote disable, but then I see that he has surveillance access all across the planet. So I use it to see what is happening outside. Just about every fucking camera was destroyed, but there were few that were still operational, many around the bunker. Jake spoke, trying to not put too much emotion in what he was saying, but his eyes began blinking rapidly. What did you see? Mara said, already damning himself for his curiosity. The blue skies turned into the shade of brown. The vegetation all around was in flames, while a couple of dozen fiery mushroom clouds could be easily seen on the horizon. Then 2 fucking dropships fall next to the camera. One was ours, the other was Dargorian. I see 2 soldiers crawl out, their faces melted. Even the advanced genetics of Dargorians could not repair the damage that was done. And the federal soldier, well, no amount of advance or armor could protect him from this much radiation. We landed a force of over 10 million on the planet. Then there was about 1 billion Dargorian civilians along with about 200,000 clone soldiers, all dead in a matter of seconds. As far as I was aware, me, his daughter and that boy were the only people that were still alive on this planet, Jake said, and finished his glass of whiskey. By the gods, Maris said, as he slowly put the glass of whiskey to in utter horror of what he just heard. Yeah. As I said, it's a weapon of absolute destruction, and I have no intention to ever use it. So we had to be cooked up in that bunker for a couple of days, and the most fascinating part I've witnessed is how much this girl was protective of the boy. Apparently this boy was supposed to be the next apex of the Dargorian ascendancy, the next step in the tank-bred human perfection, Jay said mockingly. Tank-bred? Maris said in confusion. Oh yeah, your people are probably not very familiar with artificial breeding. Well, it means that he was not born of mother's womb, but was made in the glass vial for the use of technology, Jake said, somewhat shaky from alcohol. You should have ended that abomination right then and there. You don't spare the life of dragon hatchlings, because once it will grow up, it will become almost impossible to stop, and it will rain only death in its wake, Maris said in disapproval. I ain't gonna lie, I did have the same thoughts, but I'm a federal soldier. We don't kill little kids just because they might turn into monsters later, and the girl would not even let me look in the direction of the boy without reprimanding me. Quite hilarious to be called out by a member of a nation of genocidal maniacs as a heartless monster that forced her people to take such drastic action. Jake actually smiled as he said that. She was delusional, Maris said, as he put down his glass of whiskey. It took time, but eventually she came to terms with the mistakes of her people. It is kind of heartwarming to see her being all judgmental of the less fortunate, and yet always participating in all manner of charities. Really put a dent on our budget, Jake said with a smile, as he looked up as if this woman was up there. Our budget? Maris leaned forward in disbelief. Hey, she was hot. Like it or not, Dargorians did nail the cosmetics part. Jake leaned backwards with smiling hands crossed, and Maris shook his head, smiling as well.